There's 1 week left in the Stop Killing Games European Union petition, so let's talk about the petition and the community's reaction to it. Hello, everyone. I'm Leonard French, your favorite copyright attorney. A number of you wrote to me about this Stop Killing Games initiative, but I want to give special thanks to Dom Nom Nom, who assisted greatly with the research for this video. And of course, a big thank you to my supporters. You make this channel possible. For the uninitiated, the Stop Killing Games movement is the latest effort in a long line of conflicts between publishers and consumers, not just in games, but especially in video games. When a publisher sunsets support for a game, they often turn off some critical component of the game, such as a matchmaking server, a DRM server, or a content server. The basic or underlying problem seems to be this: video games and other intellectual property exist on a spectrum between tangible, scarce property and a somewhat undefined and complicated contract between parties with vastly different capacities, and for intangible but infinitely abundant property, and we call that a license. Consumers on one side expect to purchase something and then use it until it wears out. They like to have ownership rights. They like to use their property as they please, to sell it when they don't want it anymore, to fix it when it breaks, etc. Pretty common sense stuff. Publishers, I'm just going to call them all publishers, including the developers. Publishers, on the other side, want to only grant a tiny sliver of rights to the consumer, just enough to sell, or license, a copy to a willing consumer base. So they tailor that license to give away as little as possible, only enough to get the consumer interested, and they keep all the remaining rights for themselves, including the right to terminate the license and shut down the game. Video games, for their part, have gone nearly 100% digital, at least as to availability. Yes, you can still buy physical copies of many games, but I'm hearing more and more complaints about the physical cartridge simply triggering a download and not actually having a stored and working copy of the game. With physical media, there is a need to preserve on the part of the consumer in order to maintain use of the media over time. Vinyl records wear out, get scratched, get broken. Optical discs need to be cared for and stored properly and still have a limited life. Magnetic media degrades over time and is also subject to damage, etc. But with digital media, the playing field changes. So long as you can store the data, you can have a perfect copy of your game. No more wearing out, no more breaking, just the burden of maintaining one or more backup copies, a minimal ask for storing your favorite games. So the problem used to be that games would go out of print, so to speak, and physical copies would dwindle over time. But that was the fault of the environment and the business needs that publishers have to move on and to publish other projects, eventually retiring games that weren't profitable anymore. But now with digital media, going out of print isn't a thing anymore. And this exposes those decision makers a lot more. Now it seems willful when a game is pulled from sale or stops working for reasons I'm getting to. Then insert the prevalence of online features which can be used for good or for bad, and you have a complicated situation both in the market and legally speaking. Historically, publishers have handled the sunsetting of their games in a variety of ways, but in the worst cases, discontinuing support for a game means shutting down servers, leaving consumers without any way to play their game. So let's get into the petition's details, and hopefully we'll all learn something by the end. And of course, the link to sign the petition is in the description. The petition is open to all European Union citizens, and the deadline for signing is July 31st, 2025. It goes like this. The European Union is a federated union of member states. Citizens can petition the EU through citizens' initiatives. If an initiative reaches sufficient signatures, then the European Commission must take certain steps to consider proposing legislation to effect or enact the request in the petition. The petition's representatives will present the initiative to the European Parliament, and the European Commission will release a recommendation, which can then lead to new legislation. The Stop Killing Games initiative is asking the European Union to require publishers of video games to leave the games in a playable state when they terminate support and shut down game servers. It's important to note, the initiative doesn't spell out how the law should be worded or how different types or categories of games should be handled. But it doesn't have to, and that isn't the purpose of an initiative. The initiative is the spark that gets the conversation started with the European Commission and Parliament. Publishers, for their part, seem averse to any new regulation on their trade, as would anyone, I guess. But their response seems to be to attempt to mischaracterize the simple request of the initiative as a slippery slope that leads to the doom and downfall of any games that can't meet the petition's requirements. Video Games Europe, for example, released a statement that focused solely on, quote, the decision to discontinue online services, without exploring the details of why many games are left in an unplayable state when support is discontinued. From the legal perspective, there's a lot to talk about. First, there's such diversity in games and services. Any new legislation will need to carefully define the requirements of publishers so that they can close loopholes and workarounds while applying a minimal burden on actual development and support, because that will translate to higher costs and therefore lost profits. What prevents publishers from simply setting up a holding company for each game, and when the game shuts down, the holding company shuts down, leaving no one to be legally responsible for any violation of the initiative's resulting legislation? Second, how do you get around the parties' ability to contract? In US law, and I'm assuming in EU law as well, the right to contract is sacred. With very few exceptions, you can make a contract for whatever relationship you want between parties, whatever bargain you want. So why can't a consumer and a publisher enter a contract that properly discloses the nature of the license, the eventual termination of support, and charges a price that a consumer can consider and then take it or leave it? Why can't I, as a publisher, say, you can license this game for €5, but it will go offline in 1 year? If the parties agree, what's the problem? I need to be clear about this. Just because you don't like the price or you don't like the offer or the deal doesn't mean we need legislation to force publishers to maintain games or provide an end-of-life transition. In this sense, be careful what you wish for, because publishers are allowed to increase the price of their games to compensate for expensive new regulations. Consumers, for their part, aren't actually asking for anything huge, in my opinion. They simply want their games to keep working when the publishers terminate support. One major problem is that that's a huge ask for some games, but a minimal ask for others. Legislation will have to handle those differences. A publisher of a live service or massive multiplayer or other game genuinely requiring persistent online services will have a huge burden to prepare the server components for delivery to the public if required by new legislation. But publishers should face little to no burden if required to disable authentication to a server as a requirement to start or play a game that otherwise doesn't need an online connection. I see a few ways forward for the Stop Killing Games initiative: regulation, disclosure, and incentives. Let me explain. The initiative asks the EU to consider legislation that requires games to be left in a playable state. In my opinion, the regulation branch of this legislation should be light, as in light-handed. The EU should require publishers to get out of the way of allowing consumers to play their games they paid for after the publisher ends support. Publishers should not be allowed to enact barriers such as DRM for single-player games and then fail to remove the DRM check before shutting down the servers. But the burden needs to be manageable and not so heavy-handed as to require seasonal or live service games to provide services after the game's sunset. On the disclosure side, I think it would be very helpful, maybe even a complete solution, if everyone just understood what they were buying. The end user license agreement usually does disclose and define the relationship between the parties and what the consumer is buying, as in what they are licensing, and that they're not buying ownership, etc. But no one is reading those despite everyone clicking agree. So, very much like labeling requirements on food, games could have a label disclosing the nature of the online support consumers can expect when the publisher terminates support. We've started to see this on phones, for example, Android support for 5 years, etc. So this might help consumers or at least give publishers a way to shift the blame. I also like the idea of incentives. Don't punish the publishers for sunsetting their games in ways offensive to consumers. Instead, reward publishers who choose to follow good practices. I propose the idea of a certification trademark, a trademark that publishers can use to differentiate their games, to communicate to consumers that the publisher will support the game within the meaning of the certification trademark, which that can be the things the Stop Killing Games initiative is looking for. And also, maybe the legislation should make exceptions to copyright laws that allow consumers who purchased a game to take reasonable steps to fix or re-enable a game that has been disabled by a publisher. This would send a message to consumers that they are allowed to preserve their games and help clear up the ambiguity between consumers backing up their games and pirates distributing unpaid copies. Over to the petition itself, I'm happy to report that the initiative has crossed 1.4 million signatures. It's important that over 1 million signatures are valid, so 1.4 million is a good safety margin. But I highly encourage you to sign the petition before July 31st if you are an EU citizen and support the Stop Killing Games initiative. From here, the European Commission will meet with the organizers, who will be given a chance to present to Parliament, and then we'll get some kind of recommendation. And from there, who knows, maybe meaningful legislation, which would be shocking, I know. One last point. Just because the Stop Killing Games EU initiative will close to signatures on July 31st doesn't mean the work is done. It's important to spread awareness of these issues and for supporters to stay organized. I guarantee you the opponents are organized and consistent, so I encourage you to stay informed about your rights as consumers, write to your representatives, and spread the word. As always, I look forward to your comments below. Thank you for your support on YouTube, Floatplane, Patreon, and Twitch, and I'll see you on Sundays at 10 a.m. Eastern for the weekly Lawful Masses Twitch livestream. Love you all.